Before we begin, viewer discretion is advised. This content is for entertainment. What happens when one of Hollywood's last true movie stars a man who spent 40 years making films on his own terms, repeatedly risking everything to tell the stories he believed in, surviving major failures and historic successes without ever compromising his artistic vision, walks onto a late-night talk show expecting to discuss his passion project, only to find the host ready with cheap jokes about his most painful professional moment? What happens when someone who's earned legendary status through genuine artistic courage meets a comedian who mistakes mockery for humor and cruelty for entertainment? When a conversation meant to be about filmmaking turns into an ambush about box office failures, budget overruns, and the audacity of believing in your vision even when everyone insists it's impossible. What you're about to see isn't just another celebrity losing their temper, or another moment of late-night friction, or another instance of a host crossing a line and facing the consequences. This is the moment Kevin Costner, the man who made Dances with Wolves, when everyone predicted failure. Who created Waterworld when people called him crazy? Who walked away from Yellowstone at the height of its success because he had something more important to pursue? Everyone that some artists don't create for approval. That real filmmakers don't need validation from comedians who've never produced anything meaningful. And that legends don't sit silently while lesser talents mock their life's work. Jimmy Kimmel's show had been pursuing Kevin for months, trying to book him to promote Horizon, his ambitious multi-film Western saga that he spent years developing, mortgaged property to finance, and poured himself into completely. At 69, Kevin was wagering everything on a vision most of Hollywood considered commercial suicide, a long-form Western released in installments, aimed at an audience the industry claimed no longer existed, funded with his own money because studios refused the risk. The booking came with the usual agreements: focus on the film, discuss the creative vision, let Kevin explain why this project mattered enough to gamble his entire fortune. His publicist was clear with the producers. Kevin had endured decades of cheap shots about what had heard every joke possible about Kevin's Gate, had been mocked for his ambition by people who'd never taken a real risk. This interview needed to respect the work and the courage behind it. But in Jimmy's pre-show production meeting, surrounded by writers who'd spent the Trump years relying on political jokes and celebrity take, a different discussion unfolded. Waterworld jokes always kill, one writer said, pulling up engagement metrics. This new movie is basically Waterworld on land. He's mortgaged everything. It's going to flop. Same pattern. Jimmy nodded me, aware that this was risky, but still tempted by easy laughs, viral clips, and the mean-spirited humor the show increasingly leaned on as sharper material became scarce. We'll talk about the movie, he told his team. But we're also going to have some fun with his track record. That's what makes good TV. What Jimmy saw as fun, Kevin would soon recognize as the same lazy comedy used against him for decades, reducing real artistic ambition to punchlines, treating courage as ego, turning someone as a willingness to risk everything for their vision into mockery, instead of something worth honoring. What Jimmy didn't understand, what people who've never created anything significant rarely grasp, is that Kevin Costner had weathered this kind of ridicule for years and emerged stronger each time, not by laughing along, but by remembering who he was and what mattered. He didn't make Dances with Wolves to please critics who said Westerns were dead. He didn't make Field of Dreams to satisfy executives who thought it was too strange. He didn't maintain a 40-year career by accepting other people's definitions of success and failure. This isn't about whether celebrities should expect jokes about their flops, whether public figures must tolerate mockery, or whether comedians have the right to make fun of anyone. It's about the difference between comedy that punches up and comedy that punches down, between jokes that reveal truth and jokes that simply hurt, between humor that requires courage and humor that targets the easiest. Possible mark someone who dared to dream bigger than playing it safe. Jimmy Kimmel thought he was doing standard late-night banter, making jokes about celebrities, getting laughs from familiar situations, creating moments that would be clipped and shared online. What he was actually about to do was mock a man's life's work to his face, dismiss real artistic bravery for cheap laughs, and discover that some people would rather walk off your show than join in on their own. BELITTLEMENT. And when Kevin Costner, who had faced every kind of criticism, endured every setback Hollywood could throw at him, and emerged as one of the few remaining artists who still made films, because he believed in them not. Because an algorithm said they would. Work finally had enough of Jimmy's brand of disrespect, disguised as comedy. The result wasn't just good television. It was a reminder that some things matter more than being agreeable for ratings, that artistic integrity isn't a joke, and that people who risk everything to create something meaningful deserve better than mockery from those who risk nothing. What you're about to see isn't just an explosive walk-off. It's the moment someone who had spent 40 years proving doubters wrong finally decided he didn't owe anyone proof. Any more, least of all, a late-night host who wouldn't recognize artistic courage, even if it were handed to him in the form of pre-approved talking points. The Jimmy Kimmel Live studio carried its usual late-night energy, the audience settling in for another episode of a show that had once been must-watch but had gradually become another source of predictable political jokes and celebrity chatter. Kevin Costner's appearance had stirred real excitement among the staff. This was an actual movie star, name tied to genuine cinema history, not just another actor promoting the latest streaming release. Kevin walked onto the set with the same quiet confidence that had defined his entire career, not the desperate energy of someone clinging to relevance, but the calm presence of a man who had never confused fame with significance, success with meaning, or box office returns with artistic worth. At 69, he looked like he had lived those years fully. His face showed character rather than just age. His demeanor reflected someone comfortable with himself, because he'd never pretended to be anything else. Our next guest is a two-time Academy Award winner, a director, a producer, and someone about to release one of the most ambitious film projects in recent memory, Jimmy announced, hitting all the expected beats. Please welcome Kevin Costner. The audience applauded warmly as Kevin took his seat, shaking Jimmy's hand with professional courtesy and settling in with the ease of someone who'd done countless interviews and understood the mechanics of the format. He wore what could only be described as classic Kevin Costner. Jeans, boots, and a well-worn jacket that made him look as if he'd come straight from a set or a ranch. He looked like himself, not a version styled for television. Kevin, thanks for being here, Jimmy began, sounding appropriately respectful, his tone not yet revealing what was coming. Let's talk about Horizon. 4 films, nearly 3 hours each, shot back to back. That's insane. Kevin leaned forward slightly, his posture showing genuine excitement for a project that clearly mattered to him. It's a story that needed time to be told properly. These kinds of narratives, these sprawling Western sagas about how America was really built, they don't fit into 2 hours. So you also mortgaged your property to finance it, Jimmy cut in. There was something different in his tone now, not outright mockery, but edging toward it. That's a pretty big risk for a genre most people say is dead. Westerns aren't dead, Kevin said, and there was firmness in his voice now. A boundary being set. Good stories are never dead. And yes, I put my own money in, because I believe in it. That's what you do when you're making art. You commit fully, or you don't make it at all. Jimmy nodded, but his expression shifted, as if he were gearing up for a punchline Kevin hadn't agreed to. That's really admirable. Really. But Kevin, you've done this before, right? Bet everything on a big vision. Gone way over budget. I mean Waterworld, basically. Stop right there, Kevin said, his voice dropping lower. And anyone familiar with his dramatic performances knew that when Kevin Costner got quiet, that was the moment to pay attention. We're not doing this. The change in the room was immediate and sharp. Jimmy's smile slipped, thrown off by Kevin's bluntness. I'm just saying there's a pattern, Jimmy tried. A pattern of me making the films I believe in regardless of what people like you think of them. Kevin cut in, anger now unmistakable though still controlled. Is that the pattern, you mean? The audience shifted uneasily, realizing this wasn't the usual late-night banter. This was real tension, real conflict, and it was escalating fast. Come on, Kevin. I'm just joking around, Jimmy said, falling back on the standard comedian defense when a joke fails. It was just a joke. No, you're not joking around, Kevin answered plainly. You're doing what people have done to me for 30 years, reducing my willingness to take artistic risks to a punchline about failure. That's not humor, Jimmy. That's lazy comedy at the expense of someone who's actually created something. Jimmy let out a strained laugh, glancing at the audience for support, but they stayed silent watching, waiting to see what would happen next. Look, I didn't mean any disrespect. Then what did you mean? Kevin asked, his voice carrying the weight of decades spent dealing with exactly this kind of dismissal. You brought up Waterworld, which you know has been used to mock me for years. You mentioned budget overruns, which is coded language for calling me irresponsible. You framed my commitment to my vision as if it were some foolish obsession. What part of that wasn't meant to be disrespectful? The cameras kept rolling, there was no other option. This was live television at its most unpredictable, and everyone in the control room understood they were witnessing something real. Not stage tension. Not a scripted confrontation. Actual anger from someone who had finally reached his limit. You know the difference between artists and comedians? Kevin continued, not giving Jimmy a chance to answer. Artists create something from nothing. We take risks. We put our money, our time, our reputations on the line to make something we believe in, and sometimes we fail spectacularly. But at least we tried to make something meaningful. He motioned toward Jimmy, toward the set, toward the entire late-night machinery. You sit behind a desk and make jokes about people who actually do things. You don't risk anything. You don't create anything lasting. You just comment on the people who do, and when they stumble, you mock them for having tried. Jimmy's face shifted from pale to flushed, clearly unused to being challenged so directly on his own show. That's not fair, isn't it? Kevin, cut in. Tell me, Jimmy, what have you created that will matter in 20 years? What have you ever risked everything for? What work have you done that required real courage instead of reading jokes someone else wrote for you? The silence that followed felt crushing. Jimmy opened his mouth a few times, but no answer came that wouldn't make things worse. Writers in the control room were frantically typing lines, but nothing they suggested could fix a moment that revealed a simple truth. There is a vast difference between the people who create and the people who comment on creation. Waterworld. Kevin Said, his voice carrying the weight of 30 years of defending that film, cost $175 million and made $264 million worldwide. That's not a flop, Jimmy, that's a profit. But you know what made it easier for people to mock than acknowledge? A narrative. A story that I'd failed, that I was arrogance made flesh, that I deserved to be taken down. That version was simpler to repeat. He leaned in, intensity rising. And you know what's funny? That film employed hundreds of people. It led to technical innovations still used today. It entertained millions. It exists. It's something I made that will outlive both of us, but sure reduce it to a punchline about budgets. That's easier than admitting that making something that ambitious took guts you'll never have. Jimmy tried to interject, to redirect, to reclaim control. Kevin, I think you're taking this too personally. Kevin's voice rose for the first time. You invited me here under the pretense of talking about my new work, and the first thing you did was mock my past work. How exactly should I take that? Should I smile while you disrespect something I spent years creating? Should I play along while you chase easy laughs at my expense? He stood up, the movement decisive enough to shut down any attempt at recovery. I've spent 40 years making films that mattered to me. Some made money, some didn't. But every single one was made with integrity, with commitment, with belief that stories matter, and that taking risks is better than playing it safe. He began removing his microphone with practiced efficiency. And you know what I've learned? I can spot people who prefer tearing others down over building anything themselves. People who confuse mockery with wit. People who think making someone feel small somehow makes them big. What are you doing? Jimmy asked, panic creeping into his voice as he realized the moment was slipping beyond salvage. I'm leaving, Kevin said plainly. I came here to talk about a film I believe in, Instead, I got cheap shots about old work from someone who's never understood the difference between failing at something ambitious and succeeding at something safe. You can't just walk off. Jimmy began. Kevin's laugh cut him off, not warm, but sharp and final. Watch me. Watch me. He took a step toward the edge of the set. You had one of the last real movie stars on your show. Someone who's actually lived an interesting life, taken real risks, has stories worth telling. He wasted it on Waterworld. Jokes that stopped being funny in 1998. He set his microphone on the chair with deliberate precision. Horizon is a film about people who risked everything to build something new. People who faced impossible odds because they believed in something bigger than themselves. I thought maybe that story would resonate with an audience. But clearly, coming here was a mistake. Because this show is about safe jokes and cheap shots. Not about recognizing real ambition. Jimmy stood as well. As if rising might help him regain control or at least create the impression that he still had some. Kevin, come on. Don't be so sensitive. We're just having fun. That word sensitive, Kevin said, turning back to him. People always use it when they're called out for being cruel. Don't be so sensitive. It was just a joke. Lighten up. As if the problem is the person being hurt, not the person doing the hurting. He moved toward the edge of the stage, his steps steady and unhurried. You want to know what real sensitivity is, Jimmy? Real sensitivity is understanding that when someone puts everything on the line for their art, mocking that commitment reveals more about you than about them. Real sensitivity is knowing that not every target is fair game. Real sensitivity is having enough empathy to recognize that what seems like an easy joke to you might be someone else's life's work. The audience began to applaud, hesitantly at first, unsure whether applause fit the moment, but then with growing conviction. They were responding to Kevin's refusal to be belittled, to his articulation of something many had felt but never heard said aloud, that there's a difference between humor that uplifts and humor that demeans. You walk out now. You're showing everyone you can't take a joke. Jimmy called after him, making one last attempt to frame Kevin's departure's weakness instead of principle. Kevin stopped and turned back one final time. When he spoke, his voice held the authority of 4 decades spent surviving Hollywood on his own terms. Jimmy, I've taken jokes for 40 years. Jokes about my roles. Jokes about the films I've directed. Jokes about Waterworld. Jokes about everything I've ever risked or created or cared about. I've heard them all from people funnier and smarter than you. He pointed at Jimmy Caswell. But devastating. The difference is that those people had actually accomplished something. They'd created their own work, taken their own risks, earned the right to poke fun at someone else's efforts. You haven't done any of that. You sit behind a desk and read jokes. Other people write about people who actually do things. That's not true, Jimmy began. But Kevin wasn't finished. When's the last time you put your own money into something you believed in? When's the last time you bet your home on a creative vision? When's the last time you did anything requiring real artistic courage instead of showing up and reading off a teleprompter? The silence that followed was complete. Jimmy had no answer because there wasn't one. Kevin had just stated a truth that couldn't be refuted. There is a fundamental difference between those who create and those who critique. Between people who take risks and people who mock the risk takers. Horizon might fail, Kevin said, his voice softer now but carrying across the entire studio. It might lose money. Critics might hate it. It might be remembered as another Kevin Costner misstep, another example of my so-called hubris. And you know what? I'll survive that too. Just like I survived Waterworld, The Postman, and every other supposed failure. He looked directly into the main camera, addressing the viewers at home. But at least I'll have tried. At least I'll have put something into the world that I believed in. At least I took a swing at something meaningful instead of playing it safe. And when I'm 80 years old, looking back on my life, I'll know I made films on my terms, told the stories I thought needed telling, and that I never let fear stop me from attempting something extraordinary. Then he turned to Jimmy one last time. Can you say the same when you look back? Will you be proud that you mocked people braver than you? Will you feel fulfilled knowing your contribution was making fun of those who actually created something? Is that the legacy you want? Jimmy's mouth opened and closed, but no words came. Anything he said would only confirm Kevin's point. You know what I hope? Kevin said, and beneath the anger there was something almost mournful. I hope someday you create something that takes real risk, real belief, real commitment. And when you do, when you finally understand what it feels like to put yourself out there completely, I hope someone treats your effort with more respect than you've shown mine today. He walked off the stage, leaving behind a studio in chaos, hosts scrambling for an explanation, and an audience that had just witnessed something far more authentic than anything scripted television could produce. Jimmy tried to push on with the show, tried to make light of what had just happened, tried to paint Kevin's exit as proof of a thin skin or an inability to handle the roof and tumble of late-night comedy. But every line he delivered only underscored Kevin's point, that he didn't really understand the difference between humor and cruelty, between commentary and mockery, between punching up and punching down. The remaining segments felt empty, the energy drained by Kevin's departure. The audience seemed muted, processing what they'd just seen, perhaps feeling complicit in something that had crossed a line they hadn't recognized until Kevin named it. Within minutes, clips of the confrontation were everywhere online. Kevin Costner began trending worldwide. The reactions were overwhelmingly supportive, not just from his fans, but from artists, creatives, and anyone who'd ever taken a risk and been mocked for it. People who'd spent careers being told their ambitions were ridiculous saw in Kevin's stand a validation of their own choices, a rare, clear defense of artistic courage. Filmmakers, directors, actors, many who'd been ridiculed for their own bold swings, posted messages of support. Kevin Costner just reminded everyone why he's one of the last real movie stars. One prominent director wrote, "He makes films because he believes in them, not because algorithms say they'll work. That takes a kind of courage talk show hosts will never understand." Entertainment journalists dissected the incident, most concluding that Kevin had been entirely justified and that Jimmy had badly misjudged. The tone-assuming Waterworld jokes were still either funny or appropriate. Film critics debated what the moment revealed about how we treat ambitious failure versus safe mediocrity, how we mock those who take big risks, while cheering on those who never leave the safety of the familiar. The show's ratings dipped almost immediately. Publicists for other major stars started reconsidering their bookings, weighing whether the promotional value was worth the risk of similar treatment. Several high-profile guests quietly backed out. The incident quickly turned into a case study in how to alienate not just one guest, but an entire creative community that had just watched one of their own get ridiculed for his courage. Later that night, Jimmy released a statement. It wasn't quite an apology, more a defensive clarification about comedy pushing boundaries and Kevin misreading the tone. It landed badly, only emphasizing that he still didn't understand what he'd done wrong, that he still saw the issue as Kevin's sensitivity rather than his own cruelty. Kevin, meanwhile, continued promoting Horizon elsewhere, interviews with journalists who actually wanted to talk about film, appearances on shows hosted by people who knew the difference between tough questions and cheap shots. In those conversations, he was open, thoughtful, generous with his insights and time, and made it clear that walking off wasn't about an inability to handle criticism, but about refusing to participate in his own belittlement. The film itself, the project that sparked the whole confrontation, became something more than just another release. It turned into a symbol of artistic courage, of betting on yourself, of refusing to let market logic or conventional wisdom dictate which stories get told. Whether it succeeded or failed commercially became almost secondary to what it represented. That some artists still create for reasons beyond profit, that some stories still exist because someone believed they needed to be told. Out the incident fueled wider conversations about how we treat bold failures versus safe successes, about whether we've become a culture that punishes risk-taking so harshly that fewer people are willing to try, about whether late-night comedy has eroded into pure mockery, because real wit requires more effort than simply pointing at someone's failure and laughing. Some defended Jimmy, insisting that celebrities should expect teasing, that Waterworld was fair game, that Kevin was overreacting. But most observers recognized something important. There's a huge difference between gentle ribbing among peers and mocking someone's life's work to their face, between comedy that reveals a truth and comedy that only harms. The walk-off also spotlighted a shift that had been building for years. Established artists growing less willing to tolerate disrespect for the sake of promotion. Kevin Costner didn't need Jimmy Kimmel. His reputation was solid. His legacy was already in place. He could promote his film through outlets that treated him and his work with respect. What made the incident especially powerful was that it was Kevin Costner, a man whose career of big swings, notable failures, and historic triumphs gave him unshakable credibility on the subject of artistic courage. He'd risked everything more than once. He'd failed in full view of the world. He'd also succeeded beyond anyone's expectations. He'd lived the kind of career that gave weight to every word he said. And what he said reached far beyond Defending Horizon or his earlier films. He articulated something artists across mediums understood. That creating demands a kind of courage commentators will never know. That an ambitious failure is worth more than safe mediocrity. That the people who mock risk-takers are almost always the ones who be never risk it much themselves. Kevin's walk-off became a cultural moment, not because it was loud or chaotic, but because it was principled. He didn't storm out in a rage, despite the sensational headlines. He calmly explained why he was leaving, spelled out the difference between honest criticism and lazy ridicule, and showed that you can defend your dignity without losing your composure. In the weeks that followed, other artists referenced Kevin's stand when they drew boundaries with media, when they declined shows that favored mockery over meaningful conversation, when they insisted their work be treated with respect, even if it wasn't a box office hit. His walk-off gave them permission to demand better. Jimmy Kimmel SSO went on, but something fundamental had shifted. The incident exposed a cruelty in late-night comedy that many had sensed, but few had labeled so plainly. And while his core audience might still tune in, the artistic community had taken note. The lesson was clear. Treat creators with respect. Honor their courage, even when they fail, or be prepared to watch them walk away while audiences applaud. As for Kevin Costner, he returned to being exactly who he'd always been, making films on his terms. Taking risks others wouldn't. Telling stories he believed in regardless of what the market said. The walk-off became another chapter in his legend, another example of why he remains one of the last true movie stars. Not because he always succeeded, but because he never stopped trying, never compromised his vision, and never allowed anyone to convince him that artistic courage was something to be embarrassed by. The real secret to Kevin's longevity wasn't avoiding failure. He'd failed spectacularly more than once. It was understanding that the only real failure is refusing to try. That mockery from the risk-averse is a badge of honor, not a stain. And that some things artistic, integrity, creative vision, genuine courage matter far more than the approval of people who've never created anything worth mocking in the first place. Jimmy Kimmel had wanted viral content out of Kevin Costner. He got a jest, not the kind he'd hoped for. Instead of clips of Kevin laughing along at jokes about his failures, the internet was flooded with a different image, an artist defending artistic courage, an audience backing that defense, and a host finding out the hard way that some people aren't targets at all. They're creators whose work deserves to be honored, whose courage deserves to be recognized, and whose presence on your show is a gift you can squander in pursuit of the cheapest possible laugh.